everybody. This is Justin Case of American Newscape, rejoining our friend and cousin Scott Dudley for American Consciousness. Hello, Scott. Welcome back to American Newscape.
Cousin Justin, I've got some marvelous news. This is now officially my wife's favorite podcast.
Wow, that's exciting. Is it my voice, or what do you think it might be?
Well, yeah, ever since I retired, I was kind of trying to sort out what I needed to do and when I needed to do it. This show gets me to trim my nose hairs. And and just by that, it's now my wife's officially favorite podcast.
Well, that's good. And, everybody out there, if you see that Scott needs a trim of his nose hairs, and I assure you I do need one, but if you see that he needs one, make a comment and Scott will get right after it.
You know, you get old enough and they all turn white, and that dark background is just, ugh.
Well, yeah, it's always been ugly. We just they feel confident in pointing it out to us. So that being said, hey Scott, are you ready for this? You want to tell us what we're going to be
Yeah,
talking about?
yeah. Let's kick this off. Reading is an interesting topic, and it's interesting to me because it seems like it's on the cusp.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at writing, which is like reading's little cousin. My mom and that generation had perfect cursive.
Yeah.
I
Yes, they
mean,
did.
perfect cursive, and I had kind of like metza. I had like okay cursive. I knew how to. I still know how to do it. I hated being Dudley because that cursive D is just terrible. But cursive stopped being taught. So kids today don't have cursive; they have printing, and they're stuck there. Now, I'll say this: I'm really active on social media. I'm always there for a quick comment and a quick, I'm paying attention. I don't write any of my responses. I just use predictive text.
Yeah.
So not only do I not know how to spell because I've got spell check and everything gets autocorrected, but I'm not even like the creator of my own content now because all I have to do is click predictive text, and it's almost always the middle word. So I'm like, okay, click, 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 and that's my answer to you. So writing is disappearing.
Well, it is, and that was one of the first difficult exercises we had in parochial school as kids. The most intimidating thing I saw in school was we had a first grade teacher that was about 12 feet tall, red haired, loud voice. And she said, "Look around the room. Do you see those words up there?" And Scott, it was the months of the year. January, February, March. And she said that we were going to learn those and we were going to learn them in order. And they're lucky. If I could have dropped out of school right then, I would have done it because that was impossible. Those words all looked the same. Those words all sounded the same. And I didn't whine about school until cursive came along. But see, that was an exercise in speed. That was, we're going to make you faster. Your writing will be this is much faster than printing. And it was faster.
It's faster and more efficient. I mean, because you don't have to stop and pick up your pencil or pen and put it back down.
Yeah. Yeah.
We survived that, but the generation hasn't had been challenged in that way, and probably won't be because writing itself, the act of putting a pencil on a paper, has really been replaced by devices and clicking. And like I said, with preemptive text, you don't even have to do that.
Well,
Which
you and I both still write, and probably will till the day we decide to go to the next phase of our existence. And
I'll
it's
say
you.
this as a writer, it helps me to put my paper on pencil to help keep my mind synced right with the speed the ideas coming out. Whereas if I'm typing something, I lose something in translation, and ultimately the final product isn't as good.
Well, it isn't. It isn't. But we're here to talk about reading. Enough about this writing.
And that's the trick, right? If you write something, then somebody's got to read it. Now, the dog park crew, once again,
Oh my goodness.
spent about spent about a half hour this morning, kind of, and one of them is an English teacher,
Wow.
at IVC. So we spent about a half an hour going. So here's what they say. Data suggests that 50% of us adults haven't read a book in the last year, and their experiences as teachers and educators is that the younger generations are way behind us.
Oh,
So they aren't reading to like any sort of depth stuff anymore. That's the bad news. The good news is if they're on their phones all day, they're reading. It's just little bursts, little memes, little sentence stuff. But the question then becomes: is does content matter?
well, it does. Reading for me can be a very is an entertaining experience. Some of the classics, I still pick them up to reread them every once in a while, and it is a real art form. I mean, those there are some authors that are so gifted that it's a true art form, and I'm not talking about Stephen King and some of these other crackpots that are writing books that are successful, Clancy and those guys. I'm talking some of the classics, Melville, Tolstoy. It's an art and can be appreciated as such.
I'll be honest. Like I'm supposed to be like an intellectual, so I fail miserably on the book end. I mean, I've got the classics. My great grandfather gifted me the Harvard book, 5 foot shelf book of classics.
Wow.
So I basically have all of Western civilization's greatest works, and I've read them. But I grew up, I cut my teeth, if you will, on pulp paperback science fiction, and some of it was marvelously good, and some of it was less good. But it was almost always for me a chance to leave my physical surroundings, to dive into whatever world was being created, and just kind of get a sense of what was going on there and live there for a little while and ride the highs and ride the lows and survive till the end or whatever. And that was kind of my foundational stuff.
Well,
Later on, just kind of briefly, later on, my parents got divorced, and my dad ended up moving all over the place, and I would go spend summers with him. Well, he was a book club member, and so all of a sudden I was like launched into adult fiction, and not that kind of adult fiction, but I was reading Anne Rice. I was reading Interview with a Vampire when I was 12, and it was like that was
Luna,
Luna,
Luna.
and it was good stuff. It really worked. It was interesting. It was well written. Anne Rice has done books of poetry and prose and other kinds of things too, and I kind of from there.
Well,
There was the night that I read Amityville Horror and basically crawled under my bed because I finished it at 2 in the morning, and I was like ready for the pig with the red eyes, and so there was that. But I always enjoyed reading. I'm a lifetime reader.
I was blessed growing up. And one thing that gifted me was I got bored easily. And my parents had a huge library. And I would say that library consisted of 3,000 books. And my mother would always tell me, when I walked around and said, she'd say, why don't you read a book? And go pick out a book and read it. And all those books were available to me. And I'm talking about 7, 8 years old. And I started reading them. And my mindset as a child at 9, I picked up The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was volumes. I told my mom that I wanted to read that. And she said, I'm afraid you're too young to understand that. And that was just like setting a fire
Gary.
underneath me. Yeah. And I remember I read that, Scott, and it took me 6 months to read it. I had to take notes because as a child, all those names sounded exactly the same. So I'd be reading it, go, well, who the heck is that? So I'd have to refer back into the book because, there's indexes where you can go back and appendixes where you can go back and see where, which Caesar, when they all sounded the same, which one they were talking about. And I got
Right,
through
right.
it. I don't think I comprehended much of it, but by God, I got through it as a reading exercise. So I was fearless when it came to reading, and that's all you had to tell me was you're not old enough. You're not smart enough to understand this. And I went through school doing that because my first second grade book report from the library was 30 seconds over Tokyo. So I always,
Wow.
yeah, I always pushed myself and was proud of it. And the other blessing I had in third grade was a very, she must have been on LSD, teacher, progressive teacher, and she brought in Evelyn Wood because they wanted to teach a class of third graders the Evelyn Wood program to see if we could do it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think 20,000 words a minute may have been the rate that some of us were at. And I carried that forward. So if I didn't like your book or I didn't like the history book, I just blew through it. And I still call on that from time to time. So I'm very gifted with the upbringing and the opportunities to read. And I love
Nice.
it. I love it. And I'm going to give you, then you can give me a couple of your favorites. The one book I go to that is probably the most artful book, and I think a lot of you, if you're in our age group, you were told to read it in high school, may have been told to read it in college, was Melville's Moby Dick. And that is amazing. Every time I read it, I can get lost in sentences by looking at its structure. Who was this guy back then? I mean, it's an amazing read. Some of Tolstoy's stuff is, but not all of it. Not all of it. Now, all your stuff is great, Scott, even though I haven't read any of it. I am promising to read some of it.
I'm notified on a monthly basis of book sales. So when you actually go chip in there, I'll be aware. I'll be able to track you.
Okay, well, good. Well, good. And I will give it a review. And that's the other thing. I've interviewed quite a few authors here, and they're sending me those books. So I owe an obligation to them to at least fake reading it, but I find myself getting lost in their work. Then when the interview comes around, it's almost as if I know that author, so there's a lot of familiarity. And the funniest one is there's an author, Hallmark, Harlequin. Her name's Janice Lynn, and she writes these romance novels. And she sent me the book, and I actually got lost in the book, which I had never read a romance novel in my life. But she has an art form. It's a unique art form to her, as your kids
It
do,
is.
as your spouse does. Everybody's writing is very, very. I think it's telling, isn't it? I mean, if you looked at what I wrote, Scott, being a junior shrinker, I would think you could get a good perception of who I am.
If you read from that perspective, right? Like, where is the author coming from? Why are they choosing these words? Why did the plot turn this way? What did they think was important to focus on? You really do get insight into where that person was coming from, and some of that stuff's really interesting. I want to say, as a developing reader, as a younger adult, I kind of fell in love, interestingly, with um, books that were originally written in different languages and translated back. The good news is a lot of those were in Spanish. So, like Cervantes, Don Quixote, Gabriel Marquez wrote all sorts of really interesting books about the South American, basically little villages on the Amazon. And you'd be reading this book, and you'd be like swatting mosquitoes. You'd start feeling the torpor that they had because they didn't have air conditioning, and obviously in these books. Um, and so all of all of the drama that was playing out in whatever plot he was writing to was just enveloped in this hot, humid, sultry torpor. And he was such a good writer. He was so good at expressing that you just start feeling it. You'd want to go get like a malaria shot because it just felt like you were getting sucked into this world. Um, there are a couple Japanese authors that do that same thing with their writing, and all of a sudden, you know, uh, they're writing about people who are mildly psychotic, for a better way to describe it. And all of a sudden you're starting to really relate to it. You're starting to feel it and fall into it. And that was why I was always a reader. I was probably not as much breaking down authors as really feeling, really trying to empathically get under the skin of all of their characters and just kind of experience life as they were experiencing it as the story was being told.
Well, and that's why I think that's why we develop favorite authors, because we do start to appreciate where they've taken us and what we've read of theirs in the past, and when we get something we really like, we grab it. I mean, we tend to seek them out in other things that they've written or other pen names that they've written.
Absolutely. I'm reading right now. Hey, it's retirement, right? So I'm going back and rereading some books that I really liked. And this is a book called Shibumi by Trevanian, which I'm reading right now. And I've read all of Trevanian's stuff. He's really misanthropic. He does not like any culture. And when he's writing these books, he's just butchering everybody, and rightfully so. I mean, the stuff that he points out, he's a really good historian. He does really good research, and so the stuff that he does, almost in caricature sometimes, is so spot on that you're like, whoa, he. Anyway, I love his writing, and that's one of my joys actually is to go back and reread stuff several years after I read it the first time and figure out how I've developed as a human being, because I read it from a different perspective because I've got 10 more years of whatever was happening under my belt. And so yeah, I know how the plot turns out. I know what's going to happen in the end. But each sentence has kind of a different resonance because it's bouncing off a different person.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like watching your favorite movie for the fourth time. You will pick up things you never saw the three times previous.
Exactly, exactly. Now I've got an angle on it because we're talking about a generation who may lose reading as a way to develop. And one of the things that came up with the dog park was, well, I don't really read books because I get distracted. My attention is such that I end up focusing on something else, and then I have to reread the page or reread the paragraph, and it's just hard for me to do that. But while we were having that conversation, something came up I think that's really important for kids, and that is finding exactly what turns them on, what exactly that they're just so attracted to in a book that they're going to read the book and they're going to be able to focus because it's the most interesting thing in their life. I can remember my youngest, like kind of being kind of charmed by the idea that magic could exist. And it's like, oh yeah, somebody's writing some books about that. Want to try Harry Potter? And I can remember her determination and the stickiness of her failing the AR test for second graders on that book because it was like a grand slam home run for AR points. Because it was so high. It was like a high school level book, and so she was taking it in second grade. But the questions were really, like when Harry Potter fought the dragon, what color socks was he wearing? And so ultimately she got really good retention. But there was a fail there. There was and boy, that redetermined that person heavily. I don't think anything else was ever failed again.
Well, yeah.
But I read Harry Potter. They read Harry Potter. We read Harry Potter back, and I actually read it backwards once just for fun. And it was child's literature. It was young adult literature, and it was fairly simplistic and whatever. But it was an interesting story.
Well, there's some beautiful child's literature like Dr. Seuss. I mean, it's amazing. He's actually amazing. His poetic, what he brings to poetry is adolescent, yes, but it's captivating. It's captivating, and I'll bet there's Dr. Seuss lines that you still remember.
I totally do.
Yeah,
I'm the
exactly.
Lorax, and I speak for the trees.
Exactly.
I dressed up as the cat in the hat as an adult. I dressed up as the cat in the hat for Halloween one year.
Well, yeah, and you do like green eggs and ham. So, hey, we're all there.
right?
We're
Right?
all
Aren't they always that color?
there. Well, they can be. We can make that happen.
So my favorite young author that I grew up with and loved, and then I spent a couple years teaching, and I would like read these books to the kids all the time because Roald Dahl, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was the most popular one. They made The Witches was another one that they made into a movie. Fantastic Mr. Fox, they made it into a movie. But the books were all so insightful, and the cool thing about what he did was that he put adult awareness and adult ways of thinking into child literature. So reading it as a child, I was like, oh, I see how grown-ups are handling these kind of things,
No,
you know,
absolutely.
and it was like a really good way to kind of catch up with my own maturity by seeing kind of what was expected and how people reacted to that.
Well, it is, and it's had so much influence on our personas. I remember reading my sister's high school projects when I was 8 years younger, like Animal Farm, Orwell. And
Oh yeah, yeah,
did I quite understand it? Not necessarily, but I did get something out of it.
great book. And those are interesting books because they were transformational in that they've looked at. Kurt Vonnegut was another good example of somebody who, I got Kurt Vonnegut books before I was 10 because my dad was reading them. And talk about a mind bender. He was, because he'd lived through the Dresden firefight, he had really strong thoughts about war. He was really good at putting that in kind of a narrative context that at the surface was kind of humorous, but underneath there were all sorts of very important parts of human stuff going on.
I'll pose this to you, Scott. Now, before I give you my opinion, what did you think of Hemingway?
First of all, I'm a Michigan guy. I've actually trout fished on the rivers he trout fished on. Um, so Old Man in the Sea was one of my rack it up novels
Yeah.
as an early, as a child. I felt that inner longing, that sense of desire and accomplishment, the fatality of it, the kind of fatalism that's kind of riding in that thing, because ultimately you're at the mercy of elements, at the mercy of fate. And so I liked his style, and plus he's a cat guy. Who couldn't like Hemingway? He was totally a cat.
Well, I didn't know he was a cat guy, and that the only novel that he wrote that I enjoyed was The Old Man and the Sea. And most of the others that I tried to endure, they were a Peggy Lee song to me.
He had that element. I think that that's a fair criticism. But again, I kind of like Peggy Lee.
Well, I did too,
I,
because that's all there is.
I didn't mind not always being overly challenged by the readings, and I didn't mind being challenged sometimes. One of my favorite authors is an Italian guy, semiotics professor. So semiotics is the study of the meaning of words, and his name was Umberto Eco. He wrote the one that got turned into a film that you might be familiar with. It was The Name of the Rose, movie with Sean Connery.
Yeah, I do remember that.
The book was incredible. Uh, all of the books he's written to me are incredible, and here's why they're incredible. I'm reading the book, and he's such a historian that I'm stopping and looking up the factual stuff that he's referring to. So, and that's actually my favorite kind of author. My mom once told me, she said, you're writing stuff, but it's sometimes complicated, and you may be writing above the reach of your reader. And I said, those are my favorite authors. I love people to push me to have to kind of get new perspectives or learn new things or even figure out that hard word. Those are the people I really appreciate because that's what they've done. They've helped me to kind of take on something and go a step farther.
Well, they have. They've helped you drive, and they've given you a direction, and they've expanded your mind, and that's pretty important.
Yeah.
if I play video games for 4 hours a day, I don't see how it may have enhanced my dexterity,
Your
but
hand-eye coordination
yeah,
off the charts.
but that's it. That is it. And but there's people with a passion, and I'm sure those people that have that passion get a lot more out of it than I do.
Yeah, I think that passion's, again, I think if reading's going to survive, as we're talking about it in this context, that it's going to have to be passion driven. And so, again, if you've got a kid and you want the kid to read, figure out what if the kid likes dinosaurs, buy dinosaur books. The kid likes rock and roll, buy rock and roll books. You know,
Yeah.
if the kid likes hip hop, Eminem and Dr. Dre, there's ways to do this. A whole nother way that I read is what I would call informational reading, as opposed to kind of fictional narrative reading. And so, for example, right now, I'm reading the peninsular ranges, a geological history of San Diego County, and that kind of feeds my knowledge. I want to know when I'm driving between here and Julian or between here and San Diego, what rocks there are. I'm a rock guy. What rocks there are, how they formed, why they're there, and the whole geological story. And so something like now the reading is kind of informative. And if you think about like the directions on a box of macaroni and cheese, that's informative reading.
Oh, it is. And the back of the cereal
Or
box.
you get a lump of glue.
So to clarify, if a passenger in the car with you driving to San Diego looked at you and said, "Scott, do you have rocks in your head?" you would have to say, "I do. I do."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. People would throw out the box of rocks analogy to describe a group of people that were being fairly mediocre, and I would be like, "Yeah, I love. I got a whole house full of boxes of rocks."
Well, and you have a passion for it, and you derive a lot from it, and your rocks help you expand your mind, and I think that's what we're all here, and that's part of our task.
And I've got a bookcase because when I pick up the pretty rock over by Glamis, I know the story behind the rock because I bought a book and I read the book, and now I know that there was 7 million years ago the Colorado River had a vast swamp there, and ultimately there was a whole bunch of stuff that lived and died and became the bottom and the dirt of the swamp, and then ultimately the geothermal factor bubbled up hot silicone water through that stuff, and so now you've got stuff that's called literally swamp agate. Because it formed with that hot water going through there with the silicon, and whatever swamp matter was left there then became agatized, for lack of a better word. And but I know the story because I had a book and I read the book, and because it was interesting to me.
Well, it's interesting to all of us. We just need your passion to pursue a little bit of that.
Well, and I think different strokes for different folks, right? Some people are going to be all about cooking. Some people are going to be all about feng shuiing a home, animal care, whatever that topic is. There's always good stuff in a book.
Well, and probably I grew up in a household of World War II veterans, mother and father, and maybe that's why I picked up 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. But the rest of that story is in 1984 while shooting in El Paso. Who came on the trap and skeet range was Jimmy Doolittle. And I was able to walk over and say, "Mr. Doolittle." And I told him what my first book report was, and he just smiled. He found comfort in that somehow. And
Really validating.
yeah, and and I thanked him as everybody did. People that don't know who Jimmy Doolittle was should probably go do some research on him. Just a remarkable, amazing veteran. And I'd like to see if did he write a book? I don't know. Never.
I almost imagine he did because he was so famous for all of his exploits. And that's the other thing is many of us have stories that we might not think worthy of being shared, but in the end of the day they are, because somebody else will catch that story and go, "This helps me to be a better human being. This helps me to learn something." my values are reformed because I see how they played out in you.
Well, and I'm also blessed with the opportunity to be a better human being because I have unlimited potential to be better.
Yeah, exactly. And books are one of those factors for me that really help me because I go into a book with an open mind, and when I capture ideas, I weigh those ideas critically and make determinations. The other thing is with books is that there's a validity to books that uh, oral arguments or oral information don't carry. Anybody can tell you anything, but you can't do that in books because if you do that in a book, somebody's going to call you out. Somebody's going to fact check you in the book, and because it's in the book, it's frozen, it's in print. You can't go back and use your edit function to take out stuff that isn't true anymore. And so if you're trusting somebody who's just telling you something versus looking it up and seeing what the best thinking is on whatever that thing is, uh, it's a real difference maker. And then, when people tell you stuff, you can say, yeah, well, what about this? Or what about that? Or why isn't this important? And it really, forces them to begin to have to think a little bit more critically as well.
Well, one of the common themes of my generation is we're very grateful there were no cell phones with cameras back in the day.
Or social media to post it on. Hello.
Well, exactly. And I remember dating a man that would go on to be mayor of Phoenix, and a friend of mine was on the dais to judge, and he would go on to be big national appointee and also attorney general of the state, and he was an ex-marine, and he walked up to me and he said, "You're ruthless in debate." I said, "No, I'm not." And he said, "You're ruthless." And I think I was about 16 or 17. "You made him cry." I said, "Well, I think he just got choked up." And he said, "Was all of that true?" And I said, "To be honest, I don't know." But it was all logical.
And it all came from reading. Your
Yes.
research background came
Yeah.
from a book.
Yeah.
You weren't watching YouTube's how to do it yourself, how to debate, were you?
No, I did not do that because it wasn't available, nor had I ever read a book on debate. But I grew up at that table in my household that we were going to debate through dinner, one thing or another. So
That's funny. Go ahead.
well, I would encourage everybody, if it makes logical sense to you, it may be correct, but it may not be correct. But don't hide behind it. Don't hide behind
That's probably one of the best things I've learned from books too, is not to necessarily trust my judgment based on beliefs. Look for facts.
it. Well, yeah.
Look, facts are so much better to build beliefs around than it is to kind of grab a belief and just assume that it's true because it feels good or your friends are thinking it. Or somebody
Well,
told you that's the way it is.
well, it's that old joke. You gonna believe your lion eyes or what I tell you?
Yeah, something like that, right?
Yeah, yeah. So no,
So do you think the kids are going to end up reading? Do you think that this is something that like writing kind of waning itself out? Do you
I,
think that 25 years from now that not only half of the people aren't reading a book, but maybe 4 out of 5 haven't read a book?
well, I don't believe they. I do believe it's a dying. Reading is a dying thing. I think that education has made a dramatic turn. I think what education feels is important, reading doesn't fall in that criteria. It's become more believe what I tell you. I think when you and I went to school, open debate with the professor's thoughts and beliefs was encouraged to help us grow, and I don't think it's tolerated today. And that's kind of frightening. I worry. It's hard for me to speak of what's going on in parochial education because I'm not there. But I don't have a good feeling about it, and that's perception. So I wish public education would do something to encourage me to change my perception.
To me, that's almost a safety issue, because to have a debate means that things are variable, that things may or may not be right or wrong, and I think a lot of teaching is now very dualistic. Something either is or it isn't.
Yeah.
Something's either right or it's wrong. And real life ain't that way. Real life is a multi-variable problem, and there's always lots of context and lots of factors. And so if you oversimplify it, I think you're right. I think you lose the nuances of what it's like to be a learner and what it's like to be an educated person. And I think you're also right that certainly consumer society probably doesn't want us to be as the critical thinkers that we could be.
Well, now it's like a dear friend of mine was complaining about how she was handled in a retail store, and she told me about the experience, and it was she wasn't treated well, which we all fall into that occasionally. But she knew the wife of the guy that ran the store, and she was going to let him know how poorly she was treated. And I reminded her that I'm sure he's well aware.
There's some
And
irony there, isn't there?
yeah, and he may not be any better. But if you feel some good in letting him know, nothing will change. And that's as we get older, we can become a little cynical. I'm not even going to bother. I'm not even going to bother to tell you that you might want to consider this. When I tell a company that they may want to consider something for customer service purposes, they don't care. I'm not looking for anything. I'm not looking for a free something or money back. I'm just
Right,
saying.
right.
But they really don't have the ability to care. And
Consumer feedback isn't valued as much as it probably could have been.
well, yeah, but that's how we grew up. So
Wait, the stars I put on some of the major market buying chains don't count?
you mean if you give us a review, we'll send you a $10 coupon? Those don't count?
Well, all you have to do is click a star. So they kind of, they've given me the ability to review something in zero point 0.3 seconds.
Well,
It may not be a well informed. It may not be a well informed review, and it certainly lacks nuance and depth. But they
Scott,
get their stars, and
go ahead. Before we get out of here, Scott, I want to encourage people, if as parents you did not enjoy reading, do not put that on your children. You need to do everything possible to encourage them, because this will expand their minds.
yeah. And again, I'll give this simple solution until I'm blue in the face. Every time your kid says, "Well, this is really cool," get them a book on it.
Yeah. It's
And
good.
well, because that's the book that they're going to look at. That's the book that they're going to care about and read. I mean, I'm doing that even now for my grandchildren. You know, when my son tells me that my grandchild like had a really cool experience with cheese, I look up a cheese book. I say, I zip it to them automatically through the internet. And a week later, it's at their door, and he's like, "Oh, this is the coolest book ever."
And you're thinking, you got to be kidding me. But no, but you were bright enough to recognize that, Scott. And I don't think I would have ever fallen into that category. But we do, our generation, when somebody says they loved a movie, one of the first questions, have you read the book?
I, there, you know, I spent an entire career, like 35 years, in working in the mental health, behavioral health field. When I was a Greyhound bus child between two divorced parents, one in Lansing, one in one in Detroit. And so every weekend, 2 hours there, 2 hours back by Greyhound by myself. It was like the good old days. You could just do stuff like that. And I was 9 years old. I got on the bus in Detroit, Michigan, to come back to Lansing for the week. And I always sit on the front seat so I could look out and see what the driver saw, because that was kind of like, if you were bored, you could just watch the driver driving.
Yeah.
And kind of, that was cool. But I sit in that seat. There's a copy of Ken Kesey's "One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest," paperback, And I turn on the little overhead light and I start reading it. And that book, in theory, fueled my entire career as a human being because it was such a fascinating read. And there was so many larger things going on in his book, but there was also a lot of small things going on about what it was like to have a harder life, or what it was like to not think like everybody else, and how everybody else felt about you not thinking the same way as they did. And it really inspired me. And I went back and read it a whole bunch of times more. I'm friends on social media. I'm friends with his son, and really kind of happy that my life went that way,
Well,
all because of a book.
I don't know if you believe in predetermined destiny as much as I do, but Scott, you were designed to do what you did professionally.
It's turned out to be a pretty. To me, it felt like a pretty good fit.
And look at you now. You're giving me therapy once a week. I haven't
Yeah,
reaped the benefit yet, but I'm hoping. I'm hoping.
I still, I'd like to get over that Lorax thing, right? I'd like to get over, well, but what about the poor people, or what about these people, or that's an interesting point of view, but you're excluding these other people, and they've got lives and feelings too. And but yeah, it's my mom was a high school guidance counselor. She must have like infected me.
Well, it's good. It's good, and it wasn't necessarily an easy path for you, but you fit right into it. And I think people would have to search and long and hard and far to find anybody better than you at what you did.
Well, I find it very easy to give, and giving in very small ways, taking care of feral cats, watering plants that are dying, you know, and because those little acts of kindness, those little acts of caring, like why else are you alive? Like at the end of the day, what are you going to do? Like people are going to be lining up to get your money if you get too much of it, and if you got too much of it, somebody else doesn't have enough of it. There's that problem too. So ultimately, at the end of the day, life's really short. Life's really precious. What do you put in there to make it real? And I want to say that a lot of the books I've read have pointed me in that direction.
Oh,
Certainly
absolutely.
been formulative in how I think as a person.
Well, and me for that matter too. I didn't coin the phrase "the face in the mirror," but there's lots I've picked up that I've utilized that make my life better for me. I'm not guilty about where I am or where I'm going. I'm just looking forward to where it's going to take me.
That's a really mature thing to do. It's really easy to hold everything outside of you accountable. It's really hard to hold yourself accountable. And I think that that's one of the things I've learned from books too, is that it starts with me. And if I'm not in the right place, far be it from me to go pointing fingers at everybody else who I want to believe is in the wrong place.
And I don't know where I developed that, Scott, but when I was coaching baseball to teenagers, it was never their fault. It was my inability to communicate with them. I knew what I wanted to tell them, so I just had to find that common ground. Always fought to find that common ground. It was like, parrot what I said to you. You need to tell me that you understand what I'm trying to teach you. And if you're not, it's not your fault. Let me try and rephrase it. And there would have been half hours that would go by waiting for that light bulb to go off. But see, that was fulfilling in itself.
And I think you can even take that back to books, because that's one of the lessons of reading is you have to kind of sit with something to get it. And whereas if you're watching video, or if you're watching a 30-second TikTok, you're just in and out. And if it goes in one ear and out the other, then it doesn't really matter. As a football coach, I took that same kind of personal responsibility, but they ran the laps and did the push-ups. I'm sorry.
Well, no, they have to be in shape. I mean, if you play baseball in the summertime in the desert Southwest, you better do a lot of running so you can handle those 114-degree afternoons that you're out in the sun for 3 hours.
I loved coaching. People willingly showing up to be better and willingly following authority in the chain of command and trusting really put emphasis on me as a coach to be that trustworthy person, first of all. But secondly, it was just so much easier because so many people are conflicted about their tasks and their responsibilities and how hard they want to work to please the man and all of these things. And that coaching relationship was the one where I found purest, if you will. Like we all want to be great together. Let's do this.
Well, I still, it's funny. 50 years, well, now 45 years after the fact, I still have them call me. They still call me coach. Now they're attorneys with grandchildren, and they still call me coach, and they still jump back to those days. But where I went wrong, and so many of them became attorneys, I don't know. I'd hate to feel responsible for that.
It was that debate background that you brought into the huddle before the games.
Yeah, I agree. Hey, Scott, we could
Yeah.
talk all day about this. Why don't you give me one favorite book that you had that might surprise us?
Let's see. It's an obscure. It's not going to be a household name. A book called Falcott's Pendulum by Umberto Eco. And it was a story, not to give too much plot away. It was a story of three guys who follow the history and the alleged history of the Knights of Templar through the Middle Ages. And it was set in probably 1970s France. A lot of fun. Just so many historical references, so much coolness, so much real human stuff going on in the book. I loved him as an author, and that's the funny thing when you read a book and everything else you read after that because you love that first book. Martin Cruz Smith, Red Square, another one of those. I ended up reading every book that he ever wrote because he was so good at catching that awkward but enthusiastic trying to be human that all of his lead characters had, and that was the way I always felt. So it was really reassuring to see that in a book. I'll give you those two. Those two will be my two.
Okay, I'll give you one. Um, of course, it dropped from my mind. I'll give you a genre of books. One would be Andy Rooney. I got an Andy Rooney book when I was very young, and I always found Andy Rooney hilarious. Very perceptive, and his books are written very well. And he was a journalist. So that would be one. Another one, I grew up reading Adam Smith and Milton Friedman, and they were just
Ooh, yeah.
challenging trying to keep up with those types of logics. Gore Vidal, there's another, he will challenge you intellectually. Bill Buckley, his brother James Buckley. But
Yeah.
here's the book that amazed me. It was the biography of Paul Revere. And it was so insightful for those times. And the only way I'll tempt people, you need to realize that he buried most of his children. As I remember, I think it was 16 kids because kids had a mortality back in those days.
Yeah.
And Paul Revere was he was the between affluent society and poor society. Paul Revere is the one that could communicate with both and take the messages to both. He was one of the most respected men in that time. And I never realized that because all I got growing up was one if by sea, or what was it? Two if by sea, whatever that was. Paul Revere's Ride. Paul Revere's Ride is just a scratch on the pimple of his life. He is still the most remarkable silversmith from that era, and it was just like one discovery after another, and it was a fun read for me.
That is very cool. And think about it. If he hadn't done that work, if he hadn't put in the effort to kind of connect with both groups, he'd have been doing one if by land and two if by sea, and everybody else would have been doing whatever.
Yeah, well, and it was dangerous to try and do that. It was a sex society, so
Oh,
you
that's
know
true.
the Mason shouldn't be wandering into the affluent bar where they're making all the decisions, but the decision makers needed to know what the Masons were thinking because nothing was going to happen without the muscle and manpower to make it happen.
I bet you there were some pro King guys hanging around the crowd there somewhere too, because why not?
Well, and a guy or two that kissed the Blarney Storm before we even knew it was popular. All right, Scott. Hey, I enjoyed this topic, and I wouldn't mind revisiting it when I have some more thoughts. And I appreciate what you brought to it because you brought a perspective. You opened my eyes a little bit, as you generally do, and so maybe this therapy is working for me a little bit. There's hope.
Nice. We'll do cheap science fiction next, and you'll love it. You'll be reading pulp novels the rest of your life.
No, only H.G. Wells was my guy, so read him
Oh
in
God, he's good.
second, third grade, whenever that was. But I would stay up all night just reading it. That was my first book I couldn't put down, and
Yeah.
so
Favorite H.G. Wells before we get out the door here. What was your go-to H.G. Wells?
well, it was War of the Worlds because that was the first one that I read, and I would go back and try the other ones, and I just probably wasn't old enough to appreciate them. But War of the Worlds it did it for me.
My War of the Worlds was chilling. Mine was The Island of Dr. Moreau.
Okay, I read it. I read it. I read it. All right, my friend. I hope you have a wonderful week. Hope to catch you next week. And I think why don't we put this one in the bag?
Sounds good, man. Thank you so much, Justin.
Hey, thanks, Luna. Thanks, Scott. Hey, this has been Justin Case and Scott bringing you American Consciousness. Thanks for joining us. Remember, additional information and links provided in this video is read more. Today is the day to subscribe to this channel. Please learn more about Scott when time permits.